Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Just to be clear, California's elections are free, fair, and secure. That does not mean that, like any human endeavor, we can't improve the situation. In short, what can, we should, or should we do to make elections more free, more fair, and more secure? Recently, the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission took a look at that and issued a report entitled California's Election Infrastructure, Making a Good System Better. We're fortunate to have our guest today is Pedro Nava, who's the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
So, before we begin, I wonder if you could kind of tell folks a little bit about the Little Hoover Commission, who you are, what you do, et cetera. And then why did you get involved in this? Why did you decide you had to look at election infrastructure in California?
Well, California is unique. The Little Hoover Commission is an independent, bipartisan oversight agency, and there is no other entity like the California Coastal Commission in any state in the United States. So what we do is we focus on state government operations. We want to make them more efficient, more effective, and responsive to Californians. We were created back in the 1960s, and there are 13 members of the commission. There are 9 public members, 5 appointed by the governor, 2 by the speaker, 2 by the Assembly and the Senate, and then other members are made up from the legislature. So we have a long history of taking a deep dive into some issues that affect Californians, and we're very pleased to be able to be a part of that.
So, just to be clear about, the current situation, what's the current state of the election infrastructure in California?
Well, we should be very proud in California. They are secure, they are safe, and they have been successful for many, many, many years. We decided after we did a report on voter participation, who votes and how many and how where, that we needed to take a look at how do we ensure that every vote counts. So we knew that the California elections are well run, but we're always trying to figure out ways to make it better, even in systems that seem to be working very well. We found that what goes on in California is that we rely on what is a for-profit model of developing election infrastructure. So what that means, there are vendors, they create machines and processes, and then they sell it to the state or they sell it to the counties. And that carries with it some kinds of issues that need to pay close attention. So sometimes in counties, because it's expensive to run elections and the system and the equipment are expensive, they tend to be older. If a county doesn't have the money, there's other priorities that they want to pay attention to. So looking at all of that, we found that there is a way that we think will improve what we're doing, and it's actually called open source elections system.
Before I get to that, though, I'm going to ask you, though, you're talking about these systems, and my understanding is that some of these election equipment, there's 58 counties in California, where
Right.
some of this is quite old. So the question kind of begs the question, well, if it's not broke, why fix it? Why do you think we need to change something here with open source or other methods?
Well, because if there are ways to do things better, why would we want to do them better? And what we found is that some of the systems are old. They're not updated. Remember, if you're a vendor of election equipment, part of the way that you make money is by selling updates. So the counties are not required to buy the update. And if they can't afford it, they're not going to use it. And they will feel comfortable that there isn't necessarily a problem. But again, as I said, if there are better ways to do it, why shouldn't we put those in effect?
Well, let's talk. You're mentioning open source audits. What exactly are they, and how would they benefit the system?
Well, open source is a concept that was developed many, many years ago that allow members of the public, supervised by the state of California, for example, to actually see the code that is written on how the equipment operates. And once you have an open source, then the state can can invite people to take a look at the process, evaluate it, and let us know whether or not there are bugs in the system. This has worked in other states, and it's worked in other countries, and it seems to be very effective, particularly cost effective.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, it gets down to dollars, right? My understanding is that it costs they spent like $600 million on election equipment, but if you do open source, it would be dramatically less, something in the range of $40 to $50 million. So about 10% of the cost to improve the existing election equipment as opposed to buying new equipment. That's a big saving.
Right. So part of what you're talking about is we have, humans participate in this process. You have to hire people that, first they're elected, usually in the county, so that they run their elections. But you also have to have poll workers and other staff that are responsible to make sure that it's implemented appropriately. So if you want to get the best bang for your buck, you want to make sure that the people who are working for you are adequately trained in the ways to make sure that the equipment is used appropriately, that the votes are collected the way that they're supposed to be, and that every vote is counted.
Well, one of the things, though, that you mentioned, though, with this open source approach is that it's not just cheaper, but it's also more versatile. You can kind of adapt it to each county, which is different. And also it aligns with the state goals, right? State goals are to encourage open source work like this, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's, again, because open source has proven itself to be very cost efficient. It's effective, and then you end up getting the best minds to pay attention to a particular issue. So, for example, with election equipment, election processes, and the coding of the equipment, you can have what are essentially contests sponsored by the state of California, where they provide the code to the public, and they say, listen, take a look at what we've prepared here. We want you, essentially, you're inviting people to hack your system, but it's all supervised, it's all controlled. And so people will take that on as an adventure, either because they're competitive or because the state offers some money to do it, and come in and actually apply the best minds to looking at the code, to watching for things that are maybe hadn't been considered, and to improve the system.
Yeah, that's a very unique way to approach it. But another thing you've talked about in your report is something called risk limiting audits. We're going to figure out what they are in a moment. This conversation will occur right after the break. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. While election deniers were roundly defeated in the last election, there is a constituency of folks who are concerned about election integrity. And while those motivated by conspiracy theories will probably never be convinced by the facts, is there anything that can be done to provide some information or facts to those who are sincerely concerned about the integrity of our elections? One option recently being investigated by the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission is something called risk limiting audits. What are they and how would they work? Our guest can explain. He is Pedro Nava. He's the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. So Pedro, to track votes, California counties currently use a system called the 1% manual tally. Can you describe how that current system works and what are its shortcomings or limitations?
Yeah, the 1% tally is a system that is used by most states in the United States of America. And so what it really means is that the election officials randomly select 1% of the participating precincts, and then they review the ballots that are cast in those precincts and match them up with the votes. Now, it's not entirely foolproof. It does a pretty good job, but I think when you're talking about elections, you want to be as accurate as possible. The problem, in part, is that this 1% analysis doesn't mean that you have to look at all of the races if they're particularly close. Often election officials will stop auditing if they counted 1% of the participating precincts. So tight races requires greater scrutiny. Now, the other part of it that needs to be remedied is if you want a full recount, if it's close, that has to be paid by the person who's running for office who wants a full recount. And so if nobody wants to pay for the recount, then nothing happens. So the 1% has some holes in it that we don't like.
So how does that risk limiting audit actually improve the situation?
Well, because you have a higher number of ballots that you're looking at. So what happens, and this is in conjunction with the Secretary of State for California, the legislature who has laid out a plan ahead of time, you have experts who determine more or less, usually 5% of the ballots. Instead of just looking at 1%, you want to take a look at 5%. So you have greater numbers of ballots that are examined. you have a likelihood of catching errors if there are some. And with the risk limiting audit, the recount is built into the system before the vote is certified. So that if you have a close election, you don't have to have an individual say, by the way, I'm prepared to pay. It is important enough with risk limiting that when it reaches the threshold where it looks like it might be a problem, you essentially have a recount so that it protects the integrity.
No, so it's triggered. So, there are some, while these things are catching on, these risk limiting audits seem to be catching on, there are some people who criticize them. Some critics are concerned about them. Are their concerns legitimate? Are they serious problems?
Well, it can be, depending on how it is administered. One of the issues has to do with cost, because obviously, if you have to count 5% of the ballots, let's say, that's going to be a larger number. If you live in a jurisdiction like Los Angeles, it could be 3 to 4 million votes that have to be recounted as compared to a smaller county. Now, we did have pilot programs in Inyo, Alameda, Humboldt, and San Luis Obispo County, where this particular kind of audit was implemented, and they seem to have worked perfectly well, and people seem to be happy with it.
So, but this is going to cost some money, right? I'm just wondering, it's going to place a heavy burden on some of these counties, particularly some of the poorer counties. Are you saying maybe the state needs to chip in a little more money to the county elections offices so they can do these kinds of audits when necessary?
Yeah, look, the issue of election integrity is fundamental to democracy. It's fundamental to what it is that we hold as values that we care about. And if it's that important, then the state of California should be a partner with counties that are going to have financial problems in trying to do this full risk limiting audit. It matters. And you want people to know that when they vote, that the vote is going to be accepted if it's appropriately conducted, that it's going to be counted, so that your voice goes into ensuring that government is the best that it can be. So yeah, we say the state of California, it is so important, ought to figure out how to help those counties that need financial assistance.
Well, and given the fact that the state budget's approaching $300 billion, spending a few million, if necessary, to make sure that we have election integrity, that things that people can believe in and trust in, I think would make some sense. Wait, up next, no machine, no process, no person is perfect or foolproof. The question is, what can be done to limit those mistakes? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Something that was always taken for granted, the accuracy of our elections system and the results of the election process, has recently come under attack. As a result, there's been a concerted effort to try to improve our election system, make it more transparent, and more foolproof. We're talking with Pedro Nava. He's the chair of the non-partisan Little Hoover Commission about a recent report they did on improving California's election system. You've noted earlier, you were talking about training, and I assume you're talking about both county election officials and staff as part of the solution. It appears that the poll workers really haven't received a lot of training, at least recently. So my question is this, though. There's also an issue with having sufficient number of poll workers, retirements and other reasons people don't want to do the work because of the hassles involved. So the question is, can you hire the necessary poll workers while still requiring them to engage in more trainings? Is that possible?
Well, yeah, it's possible, and it's absolutely paramount. We have to have that. These are elections. This is the foundation of democracy. So what the Little Hoover Commission has said, based on its conversation with experts and looking at how things work, is California needs to do what's called a needs assessment to understand where to prioritize the training. Not every county is going to be the same. Not every person within the county is going to be the same. So it needs to be personalized. You also then, the state has to create a training curriculum, which is a program that is specific to each of the counties and to what they have to have in place so that they can be effective and professional. You want people to participate, so you got to give them incentives. You're going to ask them to do more. Well, you got to give them something else to encourage them to do it. So the incentives are to help train election workers on topics not specific to the county, but to leave the county some flexibility to do what works where they are. We need to supplement, and this is California's role, the state, supplement the base pay with bonuses. You want the best people to do the job, give them some incentive. We also think it's important to bring young people in. Let's use high schools and post-secondary institutions to do courses for students so they can get course credit for coming in to work the elections. And then let's get it and encourage state employees to commit to becoming election workers with the enhanced training. So the Secretary of State is the entity, the organization, the person who should be able to put this together, that we see that as part of their responsibility.
Okay. You also talk about something called compliance auditing. You're saying that one of the problems in the current system is there's no state mandated compliance auditing. So what exactly is a compliance audit, and why are they so important?
Well, look, as a former legislator, right, I understand what it means when Sacramento tells counties on what to do and how to do it. They tend to not like it. So one of the ways that you hope to encourage participation is you don't make certain things mandatory. The problem, if you don't make it mandatory, is it means they don't have to do it. But without compliance, it means that you are going to have counties who aren't following specifically the way things and the procedures ought to be done to make sure that the election results have the integrity that required. So a compliance audit is basically following a paper trail that assures the trustworthiness from the time that you drop your ballot in the box until it's counted and until the time when it's destroyed after the election. So a compliance audit will require that every validly cast vote is only cast once, one time, one vote, that the records are complete at the county, and that the records are intact from the time of the election until the time we conduct the audit. So
the kinds of questions you're going to be asking in one of these compliance audits would be what? Eligibility, chain of custody, things like that?
Right. You want what's called ballot accounting. All right. So if the county sent out 200 ballots of a certain kind, did you get them back? Did the ballots that were received go through the optical scanner, for example? Are all the eligible ballots, did they come back, and were they included in the final count? Chain of custody is important, so to make sure that the ballot boxes are intact and that nobody has tampered with them. And then due diligence is you want to look at what the voting machine logs let you know. How are all that information compiled and maintained, and are there any problems that poll workers told their county about how things were done?
We only have about 30 seconds left in the segment. I'm just wondering what is currently being done then? If compliance audits are not being done, what is being done?
Yeah, I think what has developed over time is trusting that the counties and the public and individual watchdogs are pursuing people in positions of responsibility to make sure that they're accountable. But I think we need to do more than what's being done now.
Yeah, it's a more standardized, formalized process, I think, is what you're arguing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, up next, it's one thing to kind of articulate a problem. It's another thing to actually state some possible solutions to that problem. Thankfully, the Little Hoover Commission does both. We're going to hear some of those recommendations in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with the chair of the state's Little Hoover Commission, Pedro Nava, about a recent report they issued on California's election systems. And just to be clear again, it's not saying that the current system is problematic, just that there are ways we might be able to improve it. So one of the things you're talking about in your recommendations to make the system better is something called these open source elections. So what exactly are you suggesting be done there?
Well, computer people understand open source right away. The rest of us, maybe not so easily. But what open source means is that the coding that is required to conduct the operation be made available to the public, supervised by the state of California. But you invite people to hack into your code, tell me what's wrong with it, what do I need to do to fix it to make a better system. So you rely on the brain power of people outside, and you pay them something, or you make it a contest, so you get a better product.
You know, it is amazing that when you open these open source things, that people actually get very interested in, and they're, I want to say that there are people that are into this kind of stuff, not me, for sure. A second recommendation you had was something called risk limiting audits. Again, what are you suggesting be done there?
The current system is primarily a 1% audit review. That's worked okay so far, but like everything else, you can do it better. Why not do it better? The risk limiting audit means, again, supervised by the Secretary of State for California and reviewed by experts. There's a higher number of ballots that are reviewed, as high as 5%. So instead of just looking at a 1%, which does not require a recall if the election is too close, a risk limiting audit means more votes are counted, higher likelihood of accuracy, and if in fact it falls within the parameters for what would be a recall, then those votes are counted again without a candidate having to pay for it.
And given how close our elections seem to be these days, it seems to make some sense to add this extra layer of protection. Let me ask you about this one. Another one recommendation you've made again is training election officials and poll workers. Again, what exactly do you want to see done there?
Well, as people know, the 58 counties are responsible for conducting the elections, and they don't do them all the same. They don't have the same level of expertise. They don't have the same level of equipment. They don't have the same level of training. And so what we are saying is that in order to better ensure a consistent result, you want to make sure that people in California get the training that is required in order to conduct these elections. So the state of California, one, needs to help pay for it. Secondly, they have to decide what kind of training has to be put into place after working with the counties to identify it. And you also have to create incentives. You want people to come work in the polling stations. Sometimes it's a hardship. So offer them some money, offer them some academic credit, bring in young people, and help make sure that the system stays vital.
It's interesting too. These people are doing it because they're good citizens and they want to participate in the process and help the process. And so we actually should thank them when we do vote at the polls. The last recommendation you've made, it concerns compliance audits. Again, what exactly are you talking about there? What do you want to see done?
Well, many, many years ago, I was a deputy DA, and one of the things that I learned is that people behave differently when there are witnesses. So what a compliance audit means is that the counties would know that the state of California is likely to be looking at their processes. So a compliance audit is a way for the state to say, we're going to check to make sure that you're following your own processes. We want to make sure that the ballots are counted. We want to make sure that they're processed. We want to make sure that you, county, keep them intact so that if there is an audit, they're there to be counted. So we know what happened, when it happened, and what the results are so that the people have confidence in the results.
So the bottom line is we can always improve. The process is good, but we can always improve it. But it's going to take some money and effort to do that, right?
Yeah, the state of California has to be a partner with the counties. Counties are creatures of the state. And we ask the counties to carry out obligations and responsibilities for the state of California. Well, we shouldn't expect them to do that for free. It costs money to train people. It costs money to hire people. It costs money to keep things intact so that the people in counties feel confident that their elections are run in a way that is fair, transparent, and that every vote counts.
Oh, great advice. I want to thank Pedro Nava, the chair of the Little Hoover Commission, for joining us. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thank you for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.